Welcome to another car ride conversation. Today I just wanted to share the thoughts that have been coming to mind while I drive into town. And the biggest thing that I think we don't discuss is communication and relationships, especially when we're talking about the Watts case, because a lot of times we completely move past and overlook Shanann and Chris's very first date. And I think it's just really interesting because it's one of the ways that as a whole, like as society as a whole, um, we often overlook these little things. But I think it's important to pay attention. Like, are they deal breakers right up front? No, not necessarily. But you got to start paying attention to what's evolved and what's changed when it comes to dating. So I'm very blessed to have, like, my best friend married. Um, she ended up marrying her middle school sweetheart. I mean, they were in love with each other by like sixth or eighth grade. It was just absolutely crazy to think about. Her parents didn't really care so much. His parents didn't want him getting serious so soon, and so there was this whole. I mean, literally, they have like the storybook romance. It's not been picture perfect. It's not always been easy, that kind of thing. But true love, they found their way back to each other, and they've been married. Gosh, I want to say 17, 18 years, something like that. And I've been able to watch that through those years, and even from middle school. I mean, I was able to be there because she was my cousin. We've been friends since birth, and I've been able to watch that, and I too have reflected on previous relationships and how they originated, how they came about, and how they were different. Each time was very different, and I think it's really imperative to look into it. So let's just go ahead and dive right into that. I hate to even say in the old days, but back before cell phones were everywhere, back before, and I'm talking before flip phones, back when the bag phones were before cell phones really took over, before social media ever existed, you met someone, talked to them, communicated, and typically slowly, you would build a relationship. So I tell you about my first husband, and I was a cashier at a local Winn-Dixie, and he would come through. I noticed him because we lived in a small town, so most of the people in our small town were older people. You know, there weren't a whole lot of young people going into Winn-Dixie. And so here's this good looking guy, and he would come through my line, and he would buy a stick of gum. And I noticed he would come in there frequently, and he would buy a stick of gum, and he'd put it up on the little belt thingy, and we would make jokes about it. Just quick little 2-minute conversations, if that. And fast forward to just like a random Saturday night, I was with my aunt because I was the designated driver at 18, 19 years old, and we would go to this pool hall, and one night he walked in with one of his friends. And again, I'm in a pool hall with my aunt, who was at the time in like her 40s, and there's not really any young people there. It wasn't like going to the club. And he walked in, and I was just like, whoa. Like, there he is. And that night he came over and talked to me, and then we ended up out in the parking lot talking for hours. And finally my aunt was like, are you okay? Because we just walked outside to talk, so it was too loud inside the building. And a relationship grew, and it was communicating. This is my schedule. This is, and because I had not planned to meet him or see him, I was dressed as myself. I mean, I went as myself. I was hanging out. There was no facade. There was no there wasn't a pressure to present yourself, if you will. And the way that relationship bloomed and blossomed was wonderful. Now, I was 18 at the time, young, and that's another story for another time, but the way our relationship came together was really sweet. And much like my best friend and her husband, it was very organic. It was meeting each other, getting to know each other, going on dates, but spending time with each other. And you didn't know anything, because it wasn't like you could go dig through the last 5 years of social media to figure out who this person was and what was going on. And so fast forward, and I met my son's father. And with him, Facebook was in play. MySpace was in play. And he sent me a message on MySpace, and it was just very simple. It was a one-liner that said, "You're very beautiful. I'd really like to take you out on a date." Of course, I left the thing sitting in the inbox for a little bit, because I'm like psycho much, and it didn't really know what was going on. Didn't really know much about Facebook back then. We were all just reconnecting with people we had lost contact with through moving away to college and life. And I was not a big Facebook person. I really liked MySpace, because I liked MySpace in that you were able to change the backgrounds and you could add music, and that was always fun for me. And so he sent me a MySpace message, and we ended up going on a date after talking for a bit, and hit things off. It was great, and went on to be, a solid relationship, marriage, had a kid together, and military deployment happened. And again, that's another story for another time. But the way those two relationships came about, like, there was a security in knowing that I could be who I was in those two relationships, like, from the beginning. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was, you blow dried your hair and wore makeup because you wanted to, feel put together or look put together and just be presentable. But I was able to be myself. There was no, I have to prove that I'm good enough to be with this person. And there was no mentality of they have to prove to me that they're good enough to be with me. And that is not at all what I've experienced with dating apps. Dating apps is a whole freaking job interview on your first date. You learn everything you can about the person, and then you still really don't go past a superficial connection. And if you do, who exactly are you getting to know? Are you getting to know that person via the app, the person that's presented in the app, or are you getting to know the real person? And that's where it gets dangerous. And so I do think it takes us back to Shania and Chris. Let's talk about their first date. Their first date, kind of resembled like the way my second marriage was, in that they met through a social media platform. So somewhat mutual friends. I think his cousin was friends with her, knew her, and that's how he ended up sending her a friend request. And, initially Shanann says she wasn't very interested. Let's listen at it from her perspective. I know most of us have seen this video, but let's just tap into this, listen real quick, and then I'll come right back.
Get a friend request from Chris. I said, what the heck? I'll never meet him. He's just a Facebook friend. I have a million of them. Nothing's gonna come of it. Well, 2 weeks later, we finally meet on a blind date. From there, I couldn't get rid of him. I tried. He wouldn't go away. He was stuck. I drug him to a colonoscopy. I drug him to rheumatology appointment after rheumatology appointment. I drug him to my spinal tap, which was awful. A student did it, which I'm all for people learning, but not when it comes to a spinal tap. So that was really rough.
So we hear her perspective on things.
Ended up falling in love with him.
And then we want to talk about their first date. Their first date, Tammy Lee jokes about how Chris showed up and he just looked like crap, and Shanann was dressed to the nines, and it was a much more fancier, elevated movie theater. It was like you could dine in and watch a movie type of thing. And I go down even to what they were wearing that day. And it was very much, you have to break down or study Shanann in that moment, and you have to break down and study Chris in that moment. So let's talk about Chris first, and then we'll dive into Shanann. Chris showed up to this, what he thought was a movie theater, to watch a movie with a girl that he liked and wanted to go on a date with. And so he shows up in shorts, typical North Carolina, we're going to an AMC movie theater to go watch a movie. Nothing about what he wore was wrong. It was very appropriate for what he thought in his mind he was going to see. And so he's relatively casually dressed, and very lighthearted going into it. It's a first date. Of course you're excited. You're gonna go. But there's not a whole lot to write home about, because he's just Chris. Simple, never been married, never been divorced, never been through any of that, still testing the waters, getting to know and understand this whole who he is as a man, out dating. And he didn't date a lot, so from the records that we have, he didn't date a lot, and so I'm sure there were nerves and whatnot, but it was, for the most part, hey, we're just going to go see a movie. We'll see how it goes. Now let's talk about Shanann. Shanann's personality with their first date, I absolutely love it, because it's so on point with where women are today. For example, Chris talks about how he walked in and Shanann looked at him and she's like, I'm just going to turn around and talk to the bartender more. Like, she couldn't believe he showed up looking like he did to the movie. And I chuckle about it because where we are in the world today, you're on a dating app, there's so many filters, you really don't know what you're in for when it comes to a date. They walk in the door and there are more than one bartender that I've turned around and talked to and pretended like I was not there. And that's where we are with dating. But I just find it very interesting that back then, and this was before Facebook really took over social media or took over our way of living. And so, and she's flirting and she's joking about it. But you're joking and flirting, or flirting and joking about it to someone who didn't see anything wrong with what with what he was wearing. And I'm sure in that moment you laughed it off. It's a joke. It's funny. It's still funny to this day. However, it's one little piece of the puzzle. And so they talk, and clearly they hit it off. So the conversation, the communication was great in that it allowed her to let her guard down, and then, they went on their first date. Clearly something happened, because then they ended up having a second date. But let's go back to Shanann. Keep in mind, Shanann had been married previously, and while people try to say, oh, that marriage was short, she was married, I want to say 5, maybe 6 years. She was married young, but 5 to 6 years when you're married that young is not a short marriage. It's just not. I had a short marriage at that age. 5, 6 years is not a short marriage. That's putting in work, putting in energy and effort. That's losing a big chunk of who you are, because you're invested in your marriage. And we don't know a whole lot about her first marriage. However, I do think there's enough that you can pull from and gather. There was a lot about her identity that she lost in that marriage and in that divorce. And it doesn't have to mean that it was her ex-husband's fault, because we all do it. You date, you marry, you do it with your friends. How many times does a friend want to come over? And I'm not talking about acquaintances. I'm talking about friends. There's a couple of friends that can come and see you in any way, shape, or form. Doesn't matter. Like my bestie, if she comes over and I haven't done my dishes yet, she'll come over and she'll just start doing dishes, because that's just her. Or she'll come help you fold laundry. And then there's other friends that you wouldn't even invite them over to your house unless your house was immaculate, because you wouldn't want them to get the impression that you were lazy or that you just didn't care, because that's not always the case. Sometimes life happens. And so my thought is, Shanann had already been through that marriage and that divorce. She was still trying to figure out who she was. She was still, she was having fun with it. She was having fun with dating. And you have to, because depending on where you are, who you are, and how long you've been doing it, dating is miserable. And you don't have any security in dating at all. So to find someone that you feel secure with, that you feel protected, that you feel provided for, not just financially, and we hear all of these things through Shanann's testimony about what it was about Chris that she was like, no, this is my guy. And it was, he held on to her when she was sick. He didn't, it wasn't an inconvenience to him, or he didn't let on to believe that it bothered him that they would have to cancel plans and things like that. And so we see it through both of them. But then you have to kind of come back and say, okay, well, at what point did they both really start? Who was it that showed their true colors more? And how did that affect their relationship and ultimately their marriage? And I believe the correct answer is both of them. Because you have Chris feeling like he has to play up to Shanann's expectations, which forces him to do things differently than maybe what he would have done had he not been with her. And then there's a comfort level, or there's an area of letting a guard down where it's like, okay, maybe she doesn't have to approach everything with class and sensitivity, and there's a certain front she doesn't have to put up. And I think that's really what we see. We see it throughout their clothing. We see it throughout the lives. You see it throughout everything that's been released. And ultimately, you see it in the murders. And you see two people struggling with their own identities, figuring out, because you got to think, you've been married for almost 8 years, or together almost 8 years. Your identity is so intertwined with this other person. And when the lines are blurred so much because you've been playing this role of a person who truly just doesn't exist, then it becomes inorganic, and eventually it's just not going to work. And so it's kind of just one of those things with the affair. And because even Shanann had said, you know, if it's another woman, then it's done, it's over. Like, she would not even, there would be no entertaining anything after that. And that's typically the response of someone who has been cheated on. Because once you've been cheated on before and you go through that pain and that hurt and rebuilding that, you're not going to tolerate it anymore. And that's a different approach than someone may have if it were the first time they'd ever been cheated on. It may be, okay, what can we do to work on this marriage? What can we, how can we fix this? And I've always gone back and forth on if I believed that Chris and Shanann were intimate that night. And I have to say, I don't think that they were able to be intimate that night, because I believe in that moment, that's when, that's when it all kind of came out that there was indeed another woman. And it just kind of boiled over at that point. But for the sake of this video, I don't want to dive too much into the end game and the end result of everything. But I think it's important sometimes to go back to the very beginning and kind of take a magnifying glass into how the relationship ultimately began, and study it and really think about it in the context of back then, what social media was. We were all still trying to figure out Facebook. It would say your profile name is, or the house huddle is feeling, and then you would enter whatever you wanted to say, or you would enter your location, because that was the cool thing to do back then. So people are saying, oh, I don't understand why she's putting all of her information out there. Well, because guys, back then, that's what you did. And then you live and learn through the years. I mean, we created our own monster with social media, and then wonder why certain things happen. Like, online stalking was something that was created. It didn't just, there's always been stalkers, but it opened the door for people to be able to do it more covertly and no one know. So it spread a whole new ground of criminal activity and curiosity. And so I know for a fact, like for myself, dating as a single mom, the moment you swipe right on somebody and you're going to go on a date with them, one of the first things you're going to do, or your best friend's going to do, is going to be go on to Facebook and find them, and then Google them and make sure that they're not wanted in some state or something like that. And there's just an innocence and a genuine connection that I feel is lost. And we don't see it as often. I mean, how often nowadays does someone come into a restaurant alone to eat a meal and sees the waitress and thinks, I'd really like to get to know her better? How many times does a woman drive in to get her oil changed at a mechanic shop and takes notice of the mechanic that's working on the vehicle and thinks, this might be fun to get to know him? We don't really see that anymore. The only way people want to connect is through their phones. And I really believe, again, this case, there's so much to learn about it, because this case was one of those where it's one of the first of its kind where it came out how influential the amount of time someone spent on their phone was to their ultimate demise. I don't know. I think studying those first dates, those first couple of years, because there was something that Cindy and Ronnie saw that they did not like. And Jamie saw it. And when you have a whole family that sees something and they don't like it, you have to start asking questions. And that's not to say that, necessarily there was anything right or wrong about Shanann or right or wrong about Chris. It just may mean that the family was looking at it and saying, how does this fit? How does this fit? And a lot of times those that we love and that have been there with us from the beginning, they can see things that we don't in relationships and in friendships. They can see a bad influence a mile away. They can see a poor connection. They can see a superficial one. They can see a problematic one. And it doesn't mean that it can't work, and it doesn't mean that you have to go from one extreme to the other. But I do believe that there are many lessons to be learned in listening to those who have loved and been there for us from the beginning. And even if it's just taking heed and error on the side of caution kind of thing, it can potentially prevent you from signing on to something that maybe you otherwise wouldn't do. Because I think we see the constant need to upgrade. And Chris mentions he never felt like he could just be himself around Shanann. Like, his friends would say, oh, Chris is so funny. And Shanann would say, well, he's never talked, or he hardly ever says anything. And it's because he didn't feel like he could just be himself around Shanann in some way, shape, or form. And I honestly believe that was not anything new. I believe that started from the beginning. I mean, all the way back to that first date, he showed up as himself. He showed up with the expectation that they were going to watch a movie. And in his mind, he was just going to go hang out and watch a movie. And he showed up as himself, and whether she didn't mean it, I really don't think she meant it in any other way other than to be cute and flirty, but she made a comment about his appearance. And so then through their entire marriage, you see him dressing differently. You see him trying to level up in different areas. And Shanann, even Sandy has said it, that Shanann told her, Mom, he's a mechanic. And Sandy's like, well, as long as you're happy, that's all that matters. And it's almost like Shanann was testing the waters on whether or not his occupation was good enough. Because let's be honest with ourselves. We grew up, Shanann's age, my age, our generations grew up at a time when college was being pushed on everybody. And go to college, go to college. That's how you're successful. Go to college, get a college degree. And no one ever thinks about the plumbers, the electricians, the auto mechanics. You don't think about those people as being skilled and educated until you need somebody to fix your car, or until you need someone to come fix the pipes on your house. And it would be really nice to see our country go back to the trades. I really think that's what we need. But that's another rant for another time. But think about it. That's those simple conversations about, oh, well, Mom, he's a mechanic. Okay, well, she's testing the waters, and the fact that she was once married to someone who was going to be a lawyer, which was going to put him in a different class. Now, the person she's trying to figure out if she likes and is in a relationship with is nowhere near that class level. You could have a lawyer and a mechanic. And it doesn't mean that she was discriminating or anything like that. When you're raised to believe, I was raised in a very small town as well. And I never even knew that all these other jobs existed outside of being in medicine or law. Because lawyers and doctors made all the money. And if you wanted to be successful, you either went into medicine or you went into law. That's the small town mentality that many, many small towns have. I had no idea you could go be a fashion designer and make all that money. I had no idea what in the world an engineer does or did. I hadn't a clue. So even going to college, right out of high school, anything outside of medicine and law, I didn't know anything about. And mechanics were always greasy and dirty, and I never even questioned what a mechanic made as far as finances go. Because I don't know, you think of success, at least growing up in small towns, you think of success as doctors and lawyers, scientists, engineers. You never really think of mechanics and plumbers, even electricians. And they make really good money when they own their own businesses and are skilled. And that's the whole thing. Like, Chris was very skilled in his trade. He knew the ins and outs and he was passionate about it. But we see his inability to just be comfortable with who he is all the way up until the end, because he was dressing differently. Because he embraced it. He loved Shanann. I do believe he loved Shanann. He embraced the lifestyle and the living, and until he just couldn't anymore. And I really believe a lot of what Chris went through was an identity crisis that was boiling over. And when you look at it, even at the end, he first moved out to Colorado and was working at a Ford dealership. He was happy there. He was good at what he did. But in Colorado, I'm not really sure, because based on my trip out there, I don't really think, I wasn't able to, obviously I didn't stay there long enough to get into really blending and bonding with people that lived in the area, but just on the surface level, I didn't really see anybody judging anybody based on what they did. But I guess technically around here you wouldn't either. But it's almost like working at the car dealership wasn't good enough for him, so he went into the oil field. And then with Shanann, it wasn't good enough to be a car saleswoman, even though she's very strong with sales. It wasn't good enough to be a car saleswoman. Where did she go? She went into healthcare. And where was she trying to go when she was back in North Carolina? It was healthcare. She was trying to hit that socioeconomical status of healthcare because it didn't work with the lawyer. And then you look at Chris. Chris was just Chris. And then he constantly was shifting and changing. And it doesn't mean that he was miserable in every little day, day in, day out of what he did. It doesn't mean that. However, working in an oil field where you've got like Nicole Kessinger saying that it was her dream job to work at Anadarko. And before they ever moved to Colorado, they had never even heard of Anadarko. It's just they were raised on different sides of the country. And so it's just something to think about, because I do think that we see a very similar resemblance from the beginning to the end of two people coming together. And I'd really like to say, because of social media, because of the way things are presented online, getting to know the actual person for who they are and not who social media or society expects them to be, it's extremely difficult these days. Dating is difficult these days. Building relationships. I mean, you can be in a full-blown relationship or marriage with someone, and 2 years into it, you finally start to see the real person, because you can only hide so much when you live together. And then by the time you see what you see, it's it's essentially too late, in that you're already married. So a lot of people feel like you can't get out, and that's dangerous. So these are just my thoughts for this car ride conversation. Let me know what you think. I'm not really going to apologize if it sounds like it was rambling, because it's kind of the whole concept and point of these car ride conversations. But take note of some of this, because we'll do deeper dives into some of these car ride conversations later on. But I definitely believe we see a resurgence or resurfacing of the same exact behaviors from date one to the last day. And I really think that played a huge role in the identity crisis that happened. But I think it all started from that very first date. Until next time.